Right now, somewhere in the middle of the ocean, a ship carrying more people than a small town is burning through roughly $250,000 a day just to stay afloat and moving. It hasn't docked yet. It hasn't sold a single onboard drink today. That number is simply the cost of existing before a single paying guest walks up the gangway. If you've ever looked at a cruise ship gliding out of a harbor and wondered what it would actually take to own the company behind it, the real answer involves some of the largest price tags and the thinnest margins of almost any business on Earth. Let's start with the number that ends this conversation for almost everyone before it begins. A single new-build cruise ship, depending on size and class, costs somewhere between $500 million and $1.5 billion. The largest megaships in the world, the kind carrying 6,000 or 7,000 passengers plus a few thousand crew, can push past that upper figure entirely. And a cruise line doesn't build one ship, it builds a fleet, because a single ship generates revenue only when it's sailing, and a fleet of one means every dry dock maintenance period is a total revenue blackout with no backup vessel to cover it. Shipyards capable of building vessels this large are scarce, concentrated mainly in a handful of countries with specialized dry docks and heavy industrial capacity required. This scarcity means order books fill up years in advance, and a cruise line committing to a new ship today might not see that ship enter service for 4 or 5 years. That is capital committed for half a decade before it generates a single dollar of revenue, all while interest on the financing continues to accrue regardless of when the ship actually launches. Now, here's a detail that surprises almost everyone. The ship itself, as expensive as it is often not the largest ongoing cost. Fuel is. A large cruise ship can burn well over 150 tons of fuel per day at cruising speed, and marine fuel prices are just as volatile as the fuel markets that plague the airline and shipping industries. A cruise line's entire annual profit can swing dramatically based on fuel price movements completely outside its control, which is why the largest operators hedge fuel costs years in advance, locking in prices through financial contracts specifically to avoid a bad fuel year wiping out an otherwise profitable season. Then there's crew, and this is where cruise ship economics gets genuinely strange compared to most industries. A large cruise ship might carry one crew member for every 2 to 3 passengers, a ratio far more labor-intensive than almost any hotel on land. Housekeeping, dining service, entertainment staff, engineering crew, medical staff, security, and the officers actually navigating the vessel all live aboard for months at a time. Crew costs are a massive line item, but the industry has structured its labor model in a very particular way that keeps this cost manageable, and it's worth understanding why. Most cruise lines register their ships under what's called a flag of convenience, registering the vessel in a country other than where the company is headquartered, often nations with more flexible labor and tax regulations. This allows cruise lines to hire internationally under contracts governed by international maritime law rather than the labor laws of the passengers' home countries. Critics have long argued this allows lower wages and longer working contracts than would be legal on shore, while the industry argues it allows global talent recruitment and cost structures that keep cruise pricing accessible to middle-class travelers. Either way, this registration structure is one of the quiet financial engines that makes the entire cruise business model work at the price points passengers actually pay.
This leads to one of the most important things to understand about cruise ship economics. The ticket price you see advertised is often not where the real profit lives. Base cabin fares are frequently priced close to break-even, sometimes even as a loss leader specifically to fill the ship, because an empty cabin generates zero revenue while still costing the same fuel, crew, and maintenance dollars as an occupied one. The real profitability engine is everything that happens once passengers are already aboard and, crucially, can't simply walk away to a competitor. Onboard spending is where cruise lines make their real money. Specialty dining charges, beverage packages, casino revenue, spa treatments, shore excursions booked through the ship rather than independently, photography packages, and Wi-Fi charges all carry significantly higher margins than the cabin fare itself. Industry data suggests onboard spending can contribute nearly as much to a cruise line's total revenue as ticket sales themselves, in its almost pure margin, because the fixed costs of fuel, crew, and the ship itself are already being paid regardless of how much a passenger spends at the bar. This is precisely why cruise ship layouts are meticulously designed. Corridors funnel foot traffic past retail and bars. Casinos are positioned along unavoidable walking routes, and specialty restaurants are marketed heavily throughout the voyage. Every design choice on a modern cruise ship is, in some way, a revenue optimization decision. Casinos deserve special mention here because they only operate in international waters once the ship is far enough from shore that local gambling regulations don't apply. This is a genuinely clever regulatory workaround. A cruise ship effectively becomes a floating jurisdiction of its own once it clears territorial waters, and casino revenue on major cruise lines can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars annually across a large fleet. Shore excursions represent another quiet profit center. When a ship books passengers onto a local tour at a port of call, the cruise line typically takes a significant commission, sometimes 20 to 40% from the local tour operator, in exchange for funneling thousands of passengers their way. This means cruise lines actively benefit from steering passengers toward booking excursions through the ship rather than arranging tours independently once ashore, which explains why crew members on board consistently emphasize the convenience and safety of ship-booked excursions over independent alternatives. Port fees and destination selection are their own strategic battleground. Cruise lines negotiate aggressively with ports of call for favorable docking fees, sometimes even receiving payments or incentives from destinations eager for the tourist spending a single ship's passengers bring to a local economy in a single day. This has led to some cruise lines to invest directly in private islands in exclusive beach destinations, effectively cutting out third-party ports entirely for at least one day of a typical cruise itinerary, keeping all the onboard and shore spending revenue within the company rather than sharing it with an external port authority. Now, let's talk about utilization, because it drives cruise line profitability just as brutally as it drives private aviation. A cruise ship generates essentially the same fixed costs whether it sails at 50% capacity or 110%. And yes, cruise ships frequently sail above their advertised capacity by counting third and fourth guests sharing larger cabins. The difference between a half-full ship and a fully booked ship isn't a modest revenue gap. It's often the entire difference between a profitable voyage and a money-losing one, because nearly every cost aboard is fixed, regardless of how many passengers actually walk up the gangway. This is why cruise lines discount aggressively and unpredictably as a sailing date approaches. A cabin that seemed fully booked in the sales system suddenly appearing at a steep discount 2 weeks before departure isn't random generosity, it's yield management, the same discipline airlines use, trying to fill every last cabin, because an empty cabin sailing is pure loss, while even a heavily discounted cabin captures some onboard spending once that passenger is aboard.
Seasonality adds another brutal layer. Cruise itineraries shift by hemisphere and season, chasing favorable weather and school holiday periods. And a cruise line's fleet deployment strategy, deciding which ships sail which regions during which months, has enormous financial consequences. Deploy a ship to the wrong region during a soft demand season, and that ship's entire multi-month deployment can underperform, with no easy way to relocate a 900-foot vessel mid-season without enormous cost and lost sailing days. The industry also carries a unique vulnerability that few other travel sectors face at the same scale. A single serious incident, whether a health outbreak aboard, a mechanical failure, or a widely publicized accident, can devastate demand across the entire industry for months, not just for the company involved. Passengers considering their first cruise are unusually sensitive to negative headlines about the cruise industry broadly, which means individual operators bear reputational risk tied to their competitors' failures as well as their own, something almost no other travel sector experiences to the same degree.
So who actually wins in this business long term? It's overwhelmingly the largest operators, the handful of major cruise corporations that control the vast majority of global capacity. Scale here isn't just an advantage, it's close to a requirement, because only the largest operators can negotiate shipbuilding contracts at favorable rates, secure fuel hedges at meaningful volume, spread reputational risk across diversified brands targeting different customer segments, and absorb a soft season on one itinerary with strong performance elsewhere in a global fleet. Smaller independent cruise operators exist, often in luxury or expedition niches with different economics entirely, but the mass market cruise business has consolidated dramatically around a small number of giant corporations precisely because the fixed costs and capital requirements punish anyone without enormous scale. There's also a financing dimension to this business that rarely gets discussed outside the industry itself. Building a new cruise ship almost always involves export credit financing, where the government of the country where the ship is being built guarantees a significant portion of the loan, sometimes 80% or more of the vessel's cost, specifically to support that nation's shipbuilding industry and protect the jobs tied to it. This dramatically lowers the cost of capital for cruise lines compared to financing such an enormous asset purely through commercial lending, and it partly explains why cruise lines can justify ordering billion-dollar vessels years before they'll turn a profit. Without this government-backed financing structure, the economics of building new megaships at the current pace simply wouldn't work for most operators. Loyalty programs deserve attention too, because they function differently here than in most travel industries. A cruise line's loyalty tier system isn't primarily about repeat bookings in the way an airline's frequent flyer program is. It's about data and predictability. Loyal, repeat cruisers tend to book further in advance, spend more consistently on board because they already understand the ship's layout and offerings, and require less marketing spend to convert into a sale. A cruise line with a strong base of loyal repeat guests can forecast occupancy and onboard revenue with far more confidence than one relying heavily on first-time bookers, and that forecasting confidence directly affects how aggressively the line can staff, provision, and price a given sailing months in advance. There's one more structural advantage worth understanding, and it's the reason new entrants almost never succeed in challenging the largest operators. Building a single ship is enormously expensive, but building the onshore infrastructure, the private destination islands, exclusive port terminals, provisioning networks, and global sales and marketing operations that make a ship profitable requires a scale of investment that dwarfs even the cost of the vessel itself. A brand new entrant with one ship and no existing port relationships, no private island, and no loyalty database is competing against corporations that have spent decades building an entire ecosystem around each voyage. This is why the handful of major players who dominate this industry have remained remarkably stable at the top for so long, despite billions of dollars of capital theoretically available to any ambitious new competitor. This is what reframes everything about that ship pulling out of the harbor. It isn't simply a floating hotel. It's a billion-dollar capital asset financed through government-backed shipbuilding loans, sailing on razor-thin ticket margins, kept profitable almost entirely by what happens after the gangway lifts and passengers can't simply walk to a competitor down the street. The real business isn't selling cabins. It's selling everything a captive audience buys once they're already at sea, wrapped inside a loyalty system, a private destination network, and a global infrastructure that took decades and untold billions to build, and almost no new competitor will ever be able to replicate from scratch.